Ahoy there, my seafaring friends. It's Captain Titanic here with a new and exciting episode of Titanic Facts. There are some who claim the Titanic was switched with her twin sister ship, the Olympic, and sunk on purpose due to insurance fraud. Is it true? Well, quite simply, it's most definitely fiction. For 6 specific reasons. Number 1. The White Star Line self-insured their ships, so there would be no financial benefit. Number 2. Reputation. It would be financial suicide for any company to sink its own ship. Number 3. The wreck has been positively identified as the Titanic. It has her name, builder's ID, and her unique design. Number 4. It would be an impossible engineering feat. There was simply not enough time to accomplish the huge task involved in switching the ships during the brief time they were together. Number 5. Most importantly, there is no evidence to support a switch. No whistleblower, no documents, and no photographic evidence. Number 6. There are many false claims made about the switch theory, mostly incorrect photographic interpretation, which have all been debunked as fiction. For more detail on these 6 points, I will let Titanic researcher Dan Parks explain.
The switch is one of those conspiracy theories that simply does not want to go away. The idea is based on this premise that damage to the Olympic during a collision with HMS Hawke in September 1911 forced the White Star Line to recoup the cost by sinking the damaged Olympic disguised as the Titanic. Now yes, it's an intriguing concept, but unlike other alternate conspiracies out there, where there might be an element of doubt, actually the switch theory is quite definitely and demonstrably false. But firstly, it's interesting to note that it isn't new. It was first mentioned as a joke in the Times back in 1914, revealing just how improbable it was even back then. Its modern-day equivalent had its genesis in a 1995 book entitled The Riddle of the Titanic by Robin Gardner and Dan Van der Vat. The US edition was published in 1997 under the less mysterious title of The Titanic Conspiracy, Cover-Ups and Mysteries of the World's Most Famous Sea Disaster. This revised title exposes the book for what it really is, a conspiracy theory. Gardner was an unknown first-time author, but his co-author Dan Van der Vat was a Dutch journalist and Navy history writer who had been brought in by the publisher to lend some credibility to the concept. But in a classic own goal scenario at the end of the book, it quite clearly states that the wreck has been positively identified as the Titanic, sinking their own theory. The release of the book coincided with a massive resurgence of interest in Titanic due to James Cameron's epic blockbuster film, so undoubtedly spurred on by strong sales, Gardner shook off the maturity and respectability of his co-author and went solo, publishing a series of increasingly dubious books delving further into the switch theory. Some others have jumped onto the proverbial bandwagon, as quite simply the name Titanic sells. But here is a critical point worth noting that no actual Titanic author, maritime author, historian, scientist or wreck explorer has even gone as far as to even acknowledge the possibility of a switch. The reason for this is simple, because there is no evidence, and because it was quite simply impossible. Let's take a look at each of the 6 points that Captain Titanic's listed. Number 1. The White Star Line self-insured their ships. Now the fact that White Star self-insured their ships, it's no secret. It's plainly stated within their regulations to the captain, to the officers, and it was an incentive to maintain safety. As for the exact figures, this was included in the testimony during the United States Senate inquiry on Day 11, Tuesday, April 30th, 1912, in which it was several times confirmed that the Titanic cost $7.5 million to build and was insured for $5 million. Newspapers also covered that she was insured for half her value. And the insurer itself, Lloyd's, confirms the insurance was $5 million. So there's no logical motive for an insurance scam. White Star would immediately lose $2.5 million in the process, just for the ship itself, not to mention the potential thousands of insurance claims from passengers and cargo owners. Number 2, reputation. Even if we ignore that there was no financial gain, the issue of reputation is perhaps a more critical point. The Titanic's sinking was no different than a jet plane crash today. The Titanic was the equivalent of a jetliner today, i.e. used in the mass transportation and cross-continental immigration of people and cargo. It was not a cruise liner. As is widely accepted by airlines, there is no such thing as a good crash for any company, and neither would there be for the White Star Line. A simple fire would have sufficed and be far easier to execute. Ultimately, it would be financial suicide for any company to sink its own ship. Number 3. The wreck has been positively identified as the Titanic. It must first be mentioned that although the Olympic and Titanic were twin sister ships, they were not exactly identical. After the Olympic entered service the year before the Titanic, based on her experience, design modifications were made to various areas of the ship. These were in many cases structural or superstructure changes. A good example is the wheelhouse on the bridge. Olympic's wheelhouse was curved at the front, as seen in deck plans and in these 2 photographs here. However, it was decided to make the wheelhouse on Titanic have a straight front. Now let's check the wreck, as the outline of the wheelhouse is still clearly visible. And what do we see? Indeed, it is straight. But these are not the only positive identifications. We have the name on the bow with the letters clearly spelling Titanic. Also, Helen de Wolf, who built the Olympic-class ships in Belfast, numbered every item with what is known as the ship's builder's ID. Now for the Olympic, it's the number 400, and for Titanic, the next one along, its number is 401. So it's worth noting that everything recovered from the wreck site has, maybe no surprise, the number 401, Titanic ID. And that's everything from wreckage to machinery to the tools used on board. There is not one example of the number 400 appearing anywhere in the wreck site. Alternatively, there's not been one item from the Olympic with the number 401 on it. And this is despite the fact the ship was scrapped in the late 1930s and she was dismantled piece by piece with highly detailed records kept, as there was money to be made by selling or recycling her parts. That was the reason why the Olympic was scrapped. Parts of the Olympic still exist today, and unsurprisingly all have the number 400. Number 4. But then there are people who have suggested that they could have changed everything. While this suggestion oversimplifies what would in reality be a massive task, even the rear of walls were numbered with the builder's ID. There's actually an even more important problem with this claim. The photographic record shows it was simply impossible. And this is where it gets interesting. To make Titanic look like the Olympic and the Olympic look like Titanic would require that they be physically together due to the vast number of items to be swapped, renamed, and redesigned. Those who make the claim do not seem to realize that the Titanic was still under construction. And so if they were to swap the ships, it was not just making the Titanic look like the completed Olympic, but also making the completed Olympic that had been in service for almost half a year look like a ship that is still under construction. Now just think that through for a minute. After the hull of the Titanic was launched, they were together only twice. The first time was just after the Olympic Hawk collision between October 7, 1911 and November 20th, 1911, a total of 44 days. The second occasion was after the Olympic through a propeller blade, which was from March 1st, 1912 until March 8th, 1912, a total of 8 days. Now, 8 days would simply not be enough time. So if we take the longer of the two, the 44 days between October and November 1911, we can see through archival photographs that it was an impossible engineering feat. Just compare these photographs. Here we see when the Olympic joined Titanic, taken approximately October 11th, 1911. The Titanic is in the foreground, unpainted, and with one funnel. And here we see a photograph of Titanic on December 6, 1911. Between this photograph and the previous photograph, both ships would supposedly have been completely switched. And here is a photograph of the Olympic also at the end of 1911, which allegedly would have been the unfinished Titanic, completed in less than 44 days, with absolutely everything swapped at the same time, and somehow making the older Olympic look like a new and incomplete ship. Let's be honest, to any level-headed, clear-thinking person, this is quite clearly fantasy, and as the photographs prove, frankly, impossible. Number 5. There is no evidence to support a switch, no whistleblower, no documents, and no photographic evidence. This should not be underestimated. Not to mention that Hull & Wharf constructed its ship in full public view of Belfast City and employed 15,000 daily workers who frequently ended up in the city pubs after their shifts. As one Belfast man once wisely said, "How on earth can anyone expect 15,000 Irishmen to keep a secret?" But the reality is that there have been no whistleblowers, no deathbed confessions, not even one. Which is perhaps why those who want to believe in a switch have resorted to inventing testimony. For example, a James Fenton, also known as Paddy the Pig, who according to a newspaper article in 1996 told someone he knew about a switch but was silenced. The problem is that there never was any man by the name of James Fenton aboard Titanic. The crew records clearly show this. Similarly, switch conspiracists have gone so far as concocting evidence with a clearly fake video of the name Olympic on the hull of the wreck. You don't need a degree in quantum physics to immediately identify the poor CG animation, which clearly does not align with what the name on the hull looks like in real life. The question is, why invent evidence if there really was evidence of a switch? Simply because there isn't any evidence. Number 6. There are many false claims made about the switch theory, mostly incorrect photographic interpretation, which have all been debunked as fiction. There are just too many claims to go through them all, but as a classic example, check this popular meme that alleges a difference in portholes on the forward starboard side. This is what the claim states. Titanic had 14 bow portholes. Olympic had 16 bow portholes. The ship photographed departing Southampton has 16 bow portholes. So it is the Olympic, not Titanic. Quite simply, this claim ignores the fact that one photograph is before the Titanic's hull was even launched, and the other is when it's embarking on its maiden voyage almost a year later, during which time she underwent construction and fitting out. This is because the hull is launched with a basic superstructure in an unfinished state, after which it's then fitted out with everything else added. Hence the Titanic had 14 portholes on the portside sea deck bow when the hull was launched, but in the following months she received 2 extra portholes, for better light and air apparently, which resulted in a total of 16 as seen in the maiden voyage photograph. In fact, It's interesting to note that both the Olympic and Titanic were launched with 14 portholes on the port side forecastle on sea deck, but by April 1912 both ships had 16 portholes. So the claims in that meme do not reflect the truth of the situation and betray a lack of understanding that the ship was still under construction, or that both ships actually had 16 portholes at the time of sailing anyway. For many more of these dubious claims and the logical answers, please check this website, TitanicSwitch.com. Quite frankly, the switch theory is an insult to the intelligence of anyone with even rudimentary knowledge of ship construction and maritime history, but more reprehensibly, an insult to the memory of the 1,496 who were lost in the disaster. They did not die due to some half-baked insurance scam that makes zero sense and for which there is zero evidence. The real reason is far more nuanced, involving a freak set of circumstances that continue to puzzle us even today. And that is far more terrifying than any nonsensical conspiracy theory.
So there you have it, 6 key reasons why a switch is simply not true. I hope you enjoyed this journey to discover facts rather than fiction. Until next time, my seafaring friends, it's bon voyage.